In the world of war RPGs, everyone knows Square Enix, the legendary company behind some of the greatest adventures ever. But not every release was a masterpiece. Some were so bad that fans still complain today. So buckle up, because today, we're diving into the 12 worst Square Enix RPGs, according to both critics and fans. And believe me, some of these are painful to remember. When Square Enix decided to bring back Dungeon Siege, fans of the original PC classics had reason to be excited. The franchise had a strong reputation among Western RPG players, and with Obsidian Entertainment leading development, expectations were sky high. People hoped for a faithful continuation of the series, deep systems, strong co-op, and the kind of freedom that had made the earlier games memorable. But when Dungeon Siege 3 launched in 2011, it quickly became clear that something was off. Instead of the sprawling, choice-driven RPG that fans remembered, they got a heavily streamlined experience. The combat, while flashy at first, turned out to be painfully repetitive. The skill trees felt shallow, offering only small tweaks instead of real customization. The story was generic and failed to capture the epic scale the series was known for. And the biggest disappointment? The multiplayer. Promised as a highlight, it was plagued with restrictions and bugs, to the point where many players simply gave up on it. The criticism didn't stop with the mechanics. Fans felt betrayed by how little the game resembled the earlier Dungeon Siege titles. Rather than expanding on the formula, it stripped away what had made the franchise unique, leaving something that felt more like a console hack and slash than a true RPG. It wasn't broken in the technical sense, but it lacked heart, depth, and the identity that had defined the series. For many, Dungeon Siege 3 became a symbol of how Square Enix struggled to handle Western RPGs. It wasn't the worst game ever made, but it was the wrong game for the audience who had waited years for a worthy sequel. Dawn of Mana is one of those games that splits opinion right down the middle. Some players dismissed it the moment they touched the controller, while others found small charms hidden in its design. I'll admit it right away. I personally loved the idea of giving everything in the environment a sense of weight and interaction. It made the world feel alive in a way that most RPGs of that time didn't dare to attempt. The gameplay centered around physics-based combat. Instead of just swinging a sword, you could pick up objects, throw barrels, roll boulders, or even launch enemies into one another. On paper, it was a creative twist that could set Dawn of Mana apart from other action RPGs. But in practice, the system didn't always work as smoothly as intended. Many players found the controls clumsy, and the camera had a bad habit of fighting against you during tense battles. What should have felt empowering sometimes turned into chaos on the screen. Another major complaint was repetition. While the environments looked charming, the missions often boiled down to the same cycle. Clear a room, deal with respawning enemies, and move on. The physics mechanic, which was supposed to keep things fresh, ended up feeling more like a gimmick after hours of play. Combined with pacing issues and uneven difficulty, it created frustration for many who expected something closer to the classic Mana titles. Still, I can't ignore that spark of creativity that drew me in. For all its flaws, Dawn of Mana tried something different, and while it didn't always land, I'll never forget how refreshing that idea felt the first time I experienced it. When people think of the Front Mission series, they picture deliberate tactical battles, mechs moving like chess pieces, and a heavy focus on strategy. That's why Front Mission Evolved felt so strange when it arrived. Instead of building on that legacy, the franchise was suddenly turned into a third-person shooter. The change wasn't small or subtle, it completely shifted the DNA of the series. The idea sounded appealing at first. Real-time combat in giant wanzers, firing missiles, dodging attacks, and tearing through explosive battlefields. But once the excitement wore off, it became clear that the gameplay didn't deliver. Missions were linear, the AI was predictable, and the mech customization lacked depth. The strategic tension that had defined the franchise was gone, leaving something that looked like Front Mission but didn't feel like it. Presentation issues made things worse. The story felt flat, the characters forgettable, and even the mech battles, which should have been the highlight, often came across as weightless. Encounters blurred together, creating a loop that quickly turned repetitive instead of engaging. In the end, Front Mission Evolved stands as one of Square Enix's most drastic missteps by stripping away the slow-burn tactical identity of the series and replacing it with shallow action. The game failed to satisfy longtime fans or win over a new audience. It wasn't a reinvention, it was a loss of identity. The Star Ocean series had always been known for mixing classic JRPG storytelling with a splash of sci-fi flair. By the time Integrity and Faithlessness released on the PlayStation 4, fans were eager for a modern entry that could stand proudly alongside earlier favorites. What they got, however, was a game that felt strangely small in scope and oddly limited for the era. The adventure unfolded mostly on a single planet, with environments that looked fine at first glance, but lacked variety and scale. Battles transitioned seamlessly in real time, which sounded exciting, but in practice combat often devolved into chaotic button mashing. The party system allowed multiple characters on the field, yet the lack of refined AI and shallow abilities made those numbers feel less meaningful than they should have. Narrative had always been a pillar of the franchise, but here it struggled to find its footing. The cast was widely criticized for being bland, with awkward dialogue and little development to make them stand out. Even the central conflict failed to build momentum, leaving players with the sense that nothing truly important ever happened. For a series once celebrated for emotional weight and ambitious storytelling, this chapter felt underwhelming from start to finish. Rather than feeling like a bold step forward, Integrity and Faithlessness came across as a project that played it too safe. It wasn't broken or unplayable, but it lacked the heart and ambition that made the name memorable. Instead of carrying the franchise into a new era, it left many wondering if the spark that defined Star Ocean had quietly faded away. Few RPGs carry the kind of reputation that Drakengard 3 does. Messy, unpredictable, and strangely unforgettable. Released late in the PlayStation 3's life, it aimed to blend high-concept storytelling with intense action sequences. The premise alone was bold, a tale of warring sisters, gods, and dragons, dripping with the bizarre tone that had made the series a cult phenomenon. On paper, it sounded like a recipe for another fascinating, if unconventional, adventure. The gameplay switched between ground combat and dragon riding missions. Swinging swords through waves of enemies had an energy similar to hack-and-slash titles, while Taking to the Skies promised something more epic. But technical performance dragged it all down. The frame rate frequently collapsed, battles turned into stuttering chaos, and long loading screens cut momentum at every step. Even simple encounters could feel exhausting, because the game struggled to keep up with itself. What stood out, though, was the narrative tone. Sharp, violent, and unapologetically strange. It had moments of brilliance that showed flashes of the series' originality, but these were buried under repetition and poor polish. The sheer ambition was there, yet the execution held it back from being anything more than a curiosity. In the end, Drakengard 3 earned its place as one of those titles people talk about not for its triumphs, but for its contradictions. Ambitious in concept, flawed in delivery, it remains a reminder that bold ideas need strong foundations to truly shine. Back in 2008, when the Xbox 360 was still fighting for recognition in Japan, Infinite Undiscovery arrived as one of its big hopefuls. Marketed as an exclusive action RPG with Square's name attached, it carried the promise of bringing Japanese-style adventures to a console more associated with shooters. The trailers hinted at fast-paced combat, huge worlds, and a sense of freedom that would rival other RPGs of the time. For players hungry for a fresh experience, it seemed like a reason to be excited. Once in hand, the game told a fairly straightforward story. A young hero caught in a conflict against an empire, accompanied by a party of allies. Combat played out in real time with multiple characters on screen, aiming to mix the speed of action with the depth of a JRPG. On paper, this sounded like the best of both worlds, but in reality, the battles often felt messy. Commands didn't always register, Party AI acted unpredictably, and encounters dragged on longer than they should. Exploration was also more limited than early previews suggested, leaving many areas feeling like narrow corridors instead of vast landscapes. What stood out most was how uneven the whole package felt. Some environments looked gorgeous, but others were dull. The story introduced interesting ideas, but never committed to them, leaving arcs unfinished. The combat system had flashes of fun, yet frustration often took over. In the end, Infinite Undiscovery became less about living up to its ambitious name and more about missed opportunities. It wasn't without potential, but it never found its rhythm, and that left it forgotten among the era's stronger RPGs. When The Last Remnant was revealed, it looked like Square was ready to experiment with RPG design in ways few major studios dared to attempt. Instead of the classic party of 4 or 5 characters, battles featured entire squads moving as units. The system promised the scale of a strategy game while still keeping the cinematic flair of a JRPG. It was a bold idea, one that immediately set it apart from everything else on the market at the time. The mechanics revolved around managing unions of characters, issuing commands to whole groups rather than individuals. This created the potential for massive, sweeping encounters where dozens of units clashed at once. It sounded impressive, and at times it even looked the part, but the execution fell short. The interface was cluttered, the commands felt vague, and the element of randomness often left players feeling like outcomes were out of their hands. What should have been tactical ended up confusing and inconsistent. Technical performance made matters worse. On the Xbox 360, the game was infamous for long load times and constant frame rate drops. Battles that should have felt epic were interrupted by stuttering visuals and sluggish pacing. The story had flashes of intrigue, but the uneven presentation meant it struggled to shine through the technical mess. Looking back, The Last Remnant wasn't short on ambition. It tried to reimagine the scope of RPG battles and deliver something truly fresh, but without the polish to support its vision, it became a cautionary tale. Innovation alone isn't enough if the foundation can't keep up. I always thought the Valkyrie series was incredible. From its mythological roots to the unique blend of storytelling and combat, it had carved out a reputation as something truly special in the RPG landscape. That's why when Valkyrie Elysium was announced, expectations ran high. It promised to bring the franchise back to relevance on modern consoles, with slick visuals and action-driven gameplay. The trailer suggested a bold return, one that would honor the past while stepping into the future. Once released, though, the reality was far less inspiring. The combat was fast and flashy, with plenty of combos and elemental attacks to experiment with. At first glance, it seemed fun, but the repetition set in quickly. Enemy variety was thin, maps felt empty, and the encounters blurred together after just a few hours. The RPG elements that had once given the series so much depth were stripped down, leaving a system that looked dynamic but lacked staying power. The story, which had always been a strength, felt thin and undercooked. Characters didn't leave much of an impression, and the world building that once gave the franchise its unique identity was barely present. What should have been an emotional journey instead played out like a series of disconnected battles. In the end, Valkyrie Elysium wasn't a disaster, but it carried the weight of a legacy it couldn't live up to. For a series once known for ambition and depth, this entry felt more like a placeholder, a reminder of greatness past, rather than a new chapter worthy of the name. I'll admit, I liked Forspoken a little when I first tried it. The movement system had a certain thrill, sprinting across landscapes with magical parkour, leaping from cliffs, and chaining elemental spells together. For a brief moment, it felt like the kind of modern action RPG that could capture both spectacle and freedom. There were flashes of potential, those times when combat flowed smoothly, and the world looked ready to be explored in style. But the cracks appeared quickly. The open world was vast, yet strangely empty, filled with icons rather than meaningful discoveries. Battles became repetitive, with flashy effects masking the lack of real depth. The spell system offered variety on paper, but switching between them mid-combat often felt clumsy. Instead of building strategy, fights turned into visual noise. The narrative didn't help. The dialogue often landed awkwardly, with lines that felt out of place and writing that struggled to connect. The protagonist's journey had emotional beats, but they were buried under moments that players described as cringeworthy. Even the technical side betrayed the ambition, with performance issues on PC and visuals that failed to impress on hardware meant to showcase next-gen power. In the end, Forspoken wasn't without moments of fun, but those moments couldn't carry the whole experience. What began with excitement and energy soon faded into routine, leaving a game remembered less for what it achieved and more for what it failed to deliver. On the PSP, hunting games were a huge trend. Titles like Monster Hunter had proven that portable systems could deliver deep, rewarding gameplay built around fighting giant creatures. Lord of Arcana tried to ride that same wave, but with a darker, more brutal twist. The premise was solid, players stepping into the role of a chosen warrior, taking on towering monsters, collecting loot, and upgrading gear. Everything sounded like it should have worked. In practice, the combat was sluggish and unpolished. Battles lacked the precision that defined the genre, with attacks feeling heavy in the wrong way. Not weighty and satisfying, but slow and awkward. The camera often worked against the player, making it difficult to track fast-moving enemies. Missions were structured around repetitive hunts that quickly became more of a chore than a challenge. Instead of pushing players to refine their skills, the design leaned on grinding, stretching out progress without adding much variety. Visually, the game carried a grim atmosphere that suited its tone, but the presentation couldn't make up for the lack of balance in gameplay. Enemies were dangerous, but not in a way that felt fair, and the pacing dragged. What could have been an engaging alternative to other hunting RPGs ended up feeling like an imitation that never found its own identity. Lord of Arcana showed that simply copying a formula isn't enough. Without the tight mechanics and satisfying flow that define this kind of RPG, the result was an experience remembered more for repetition and frustration than for epic battles. On paper, Unlimited Saga was supposed to be bold and innovative. Instead of the usual flow of an RPG, the game presented players with board-like exploration, where towns and dungeons were just static backdrops. The most infamous mechanic was the roulette wheel. Every action, from swinging a sword, opening a chest, even stepping forward, required stopping the wheel at the right moment. The idea was to add tension and variety, but in practice it slowed everything down. Combat became less about planning strategies and more about watching a spinning bar over and over. Fans expecting an epic PS2 adventure were shocked. The presentation had a watercolor beauty, but once you pressed start, the design felt stiff and confusing. Tutorials gave little guidance, making the learning curve almost vertical. Instead of discovering secrets naturally, players had to fight against layers of opaque systems. For many, the sense of progression vanished, replaced by frustration and exhaustion. And here's the part that really stayed with me. I went back to this game recently, curious if I had judged it too harshly years ago. Sometimes older titles age better than we remember, but the moment I hit that roulette wheel again, the same feelings returned. I tried to push further, but the joy never came. It reminded me exactly why Unlimited Saga became known as one of Square Enix's strangest and most disappointing RPG experiments. The Mana series had long been associated with colorful action RPGs, full of exploration, charming characters, and a strong sense of adventure. When Heroes of Mana appeared on the Nintendo DS, it promised something very different, a tactical spin on the franchise, mixing real-time strategy with RPG elements. It was an ambitious idea, one that aimed to give handheld players the thrill of commanding armies while still keeping the heart of the Mana universe. Instead of controlling a single hero in action combat, players guided units across maps, building bases, and sending groups into battle. On paper, this gave the series a fresh angle, allowing for larger-scale encounters than ever before. The dual screens of the DS seemed like a perfect fit for organizing troops and tracking objectives. But once players got into the rhythm, the shortcomings became clear. The artificial intelligence often worked against the player, with units taking odd paths or failing to follow orders properly. Resource management was shallow, limiting strategic depth, and missions often felt repetitive, relying more on endurance than clever planning. The story tried to capture the familiar spirit of the franchise, but the constant interruptions from clunky gameplay left it struggling to leave an impact. By the time the credits rolled, many felt that Heroes of Mana had missed its mark. It was ambitious in scope, but lacked the polish and precision needed to carry its ideas. Rather than expanding the series into a bold new direction, it became a reminder that not every franchise fits neatly into every genre. And that's our look at 12 RPGs that carried big names and bold ideas, but ended up remembered for the wrong reasons. It's a different kind of list, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Some failed with clunky gameplay, others with weak stories or poor execution, yet all remain part of the RPG history. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which of these do you think deserved better?